Restorative Justice and Gender-Based Violence, Exploring Principles, Practices, and Challenges. Today's virtual forum discusses alternative justice practices in the context of GBV. We just want to share a reminder that we understand that these topics can be deeply personal, and we encourage you to engage in whatever way is comfortable for you. Please feel free to step away or take a break at any time. We acknowledge that the discussions may include lived experiences related to gender-based violence, help seeking, and survivors' experiences. Some speakers may also share perspectives on working with people who have caused harm. So we just want you to feel free if you need to step away or take a break at any time. And we also invite you to check the chat where we will share information on available supports. I'm pleased now to introduce Dr. Barry Van Sarikaya from OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, and one of our provincial advisory group members at the Learning Network. Dr. Barry Van will be moderating this session and will open the panel by first introducing our panelists and then starting the discussion. Dr. Barry Van, go ahead.
Thank you, Margarita. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel titled Restorative Justice and Gender-Based Violence, Exploring Principles, Practices, and Challenges. My name is Berivan Kutlay Sarıkaya, and I'm honored to serve as the moderator for today's session. This panel aims to explore the application of restorative justice within the context of addressing gender-based violence, with an emphasis on the foundational principles and diverse influences that shape this approach. It's a pleasure to welcome our panelists, and I look forward to the insightful conversations ahead. To begin, I would like to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras. And I will now introduce each of them and share a brief overview of their backgrounds. Their full bios also you can find in the forum program. Kate Crozier is the interim executive director at Community Justice Initiatives. Before Community Justice Initiatives, Kate dedicated much of her career to supporting individuals impacted by violence. Along the way, she worked with criminalized youth, homeless women, and sexually abused men, experiences that deepened her understanding of how systemic failures often lead to criminalization rather than the support people deserve. Over the past 2 decades, she spent 10 years in violence against women sector and 10 years in restorative justice. Wayomi Dion Nahiyav Iskwao from Kihiwin Cree Nation is a mother to 2 beautiful children, social worker, good relationships worker, and justice advocate for Indigenous communities. She has worked in the justice field for a number of years in different capacities, working with victims of crime, restorative justice practices, and now in her current role as the coordinator for the Healing to Wellness Court in St. Paul, Alberta. The Healing to Wellness Court emphasizes utilizing restorative justice, working with individuals, families, and communities that addresses root causes of harm, trauma, and addictions. And finally, Narmin Kerim is the Director of Programs and Operations at North Shore Restorative Justice Society. As a lawyer, she worked in family law, mostly with women leaving abusive relationships and in poverty law. She held the position of manager of NSRJ's Restorative Response Program for almost 5 years. Her success in resolving sexual assaults restoratively led her to pursue her Master's of Law, focusing on the use of restorative responses to gender-based violence. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. And now let's dive into our discussions. To start, I would like to ask to all our panelists. So, to better understand the foundation of your expertise in restorative justice, could you share the journey that led you to restorative justice, including key influences and worldviews that inform your approach to this work? Kate?
Thanks so much, and thanks for being here, everybody. Yeah, as shared in my short bio there, my work in the violence against women sector had a huge influence over the work I'm doing now. In that work, I learned so much about intersectional feminism, trauma-informed practices, systemic barriers to safety, advocacy, risk assessment, safety planning, strengths-based counseling, group work. And I experienced a very loving mentorship by some very hardworking, brilliant feminists that I still hold close to my heart. And in this work, I started to notice a lack of congruence between the analysis we held for the actions of female identified survivors, which was highly trauma informed, and the analysis that really didn't exist for men who caused harm. We named them as manipulators, predators, monsters. And my curiosity around this discrepancy led me in part to restorative justice. I came to this work with deep skepticism. Um, Restorative justice has changed over the last decade. When I came to this work, I didn't see a respect for feminist analysis. I didn't see anti-racist, anti-oppressive values. Instead, I heard that restorative justice just naturally, inherently does equity work by the way it is set up. And I wondered if I'd made a huge mistake coming into this field. So in my first few weeks of doing this work, I drew some Zen circle diagram around the values that were important to me around the violence against women influence. And what I was hearing was the approach of a restorative approach to sexual harm. And in the middle is the piece where I started my work from, which was believing survivors. Sexual harm is wrong. We must confront the attitudes that allow for sexual harm to manifest. Police and courts aren't helpful most of the time, but a caring, informed community can be. Support must be trauma-informed, victim-centered, that we value narratives of experiences over legal definitions of harm, and we must engage the community in this work. And so I was able to stay connected with integrity with this approach. Things have changed and evolved, and now restorative work around gender-based harm looks different. Along the way, I leaned heavily into the writings of Black and queer feminists and abolitionists such as Elle Jones, Michelle Alexander, Erica Miners, Robin Maynard, and Kai Chang Tom, and Adrienne Marie Brown, Mia Menges, to help me understand what a future without state violence can look like. One instead where we as citizens and community members can support people and hold one another accountable.
Thank you, Katie. Nermin?
Thanks, Berivan. As Berivan mentioned before, the way I came into restorative justice was really starting from family law with representing mostly women leaving abusive relationships. I have to say that in that area, I was banging my head against the wall. The men all appeared charming and articulate, while the women, they were frazzled and distraught because of what they'd endured. And it was really tough for me to do anything useful in that environment. During that time, like Kate mentioned, I was surrounded by a group of fierce feminist mentors who worked in the violence against women sector. And there was a group of us, which we called the Jane Doe Network, and I learned so much from them. At the same time, I was volunteering for North Shore Restorative Justice and later got hired as the manager for their police-referred pre-charge diversion program, which we call the Restorative Response Program. And during the 5 years I was there, our team resolved about 30 gender-based violence files to the victim's satisfaction. And many of them were sexual assaults. And that was very mind-changing for me. It sort of started this new worldview. And I'd like to share a story that helped me get there. My very first sexual assault file, which was in 2018, was two Catholic schoolgirls who had each been separately sexually assaulted by the same youth in their school. They found out about each other and they came together to the police to report it so that something would be in his file if this ever happened again. But they absolutely did not want this to go to court. Their privacy was uber important to them. And when somebody comes forward like this to the police, it's called an information-only report. And some of you in the sector might have heard of third-party reports, where someone other than the harmed party comes forward. But this is different. This is the girls themselves coming forward with their parents, of course. And so this becomes an information only report because they're sure they don't want to go to court. And in this scenario, police can comfortably consider a referral to restorative justice. So the process began with me meeting each girl separately, and they shared what they wanted to share about their experience. We didn't probe them on this. We believed them. And then we focused on their goals. What did they need? They had two main goals, and over the years, I found this to be very common. The first one is validation, that they didn't invite this sexual assault in any way. And second, that this young man not do this to anyone else in the future. Those are the two most common things we hear over and over. And here's where my worldview plays a big role. We met with the youth who had harmed these girls and got to know him as a human. I believe that everybody has good in them, and also that they sometimes do very bad things, extremely bad things, like sexually assaulting women. But I think very few people are true psychopaths. When I was meeting with this young man, I remember joking with my kids, "Hey kids, I'm going out for a hot chocolate with my sex offender." It was just one of those things. And it's truly, he was a sweet, shy, isolated young man whose immigrant mom was working two minimum wage jobs back to back to make ends meet, and she was never home. He was alone, and he felt like his life was out of control. And this, sexually assaulting women, was his way of getting some control back in his life. Absolutely not okay, but that's what was going on for him. And we were able to get him to a point where he wrote each of the girls a letter that stated not only that he sexually assaulted them, but how he did so. And he wrote in there that they scratched and pushed him away, and he pressed on. He told us much more than the girls did about what happened. He also agreed to come with me to the Ministry of Children and Family and report what he had done so that he could get the help he needed. Honestly, a part of him was relieved that somebody finally caught him so that he wouldn't get carried into this form. Can you imagine this young man would have ended up being a sexual predator as an adult, and how terrible that would have been for the world? The counselor that he was assigned to, she kept in touch with me and reported that he was doing really well. In this process, the girls got a choice. They had a voice in this. They were not violently re-traumatized as they most likely would have been had they chosen the criminal justice system. And these types of experiences made me such a strong believer in restorative justice for gender-based violence, which is why I went back to school a couple years ago to get my Master of Law, focusing on the use of restorative justice for gender-based violence.
Thank you so much, Nermin. Wyoming?
Good afternoon. Hopefully everything's okay. I had some technical issues there. But my name is Wyoming Dion, and I actually want to begin with a story. I truly believe everything begins with a story. And this story acknowledges actually my late Muslim, George Dion, my grandfather. So my Muslim attended residential school from the ages 7 to 11 at Blue Quills. And my Muslim was actually the last Cree speaker in my family, and it wasn't passed down to his children or his grandchildren. He didn't finish school, and he really struggled to read and write. But oh my gosh, was he ever a hard worker? He worked doing anything and everything to provide for his family. He built many buildings, which actually included the St. Paul courthouse where I currently work at now. Throughout his life, he struggled with addictions, which ultimately actually ended up with him being involved in the criminal justice system himself. And so much like the revolving door, he was in and out of jail. And I actually often wonder what it would look like if maybe one person reached out to learn about him and to understand his experience and to offer to walk beside him in his healing journey. And I can only imagine what our communities could look like. So a little bit of a background, I went actually to school at Blue Quills University myself, where I spent the last 6 years studying social work in the same space that my late Muslim was in residential school. And in that space, I really learned who I was as a Neheo Esqueo. I began to speak my language, and I rooted myself in ceremony within their social work program. And I'll be graduating with my master's in June. So a little bit about that too is I did some work with victim services for a few years, which ultimately actually led me to working with the Healing to Wellness court that's being provided now where I currently am. And I think for me, restorative justice entails restoring individuals with themselves first and foremost, and then working on repairing harm to others in the community. If we begin treating one another, I guess, with love and kindness and understanding that this is where healing truly begins and how relationships are foundational. So that's just a little bit about where I guess RJ has found me. And I think that this is just historical in the experience of not only my families, but much the same as a lot of the families that we work with or in the surrounding communities as well.
Thanks, Bayomi, and thank you all for sharing your insights and also the stories with us. And it was always very fascinating to hear about the diverse paths that have led each of you to restorative justice. And I would like to move us on the next question, starting with Bayomi. Bayomi, in your work, how have Indigenous practices or teachings shaped your understanding and application of restorative justice? What challenges have you encountered in integrating these into your practice?
Yes, thank you. So we do hear about the principles of restorative justice. But I also recognize that as we as Indigenous people, we also have our own laws and our own laws of love and kindness and honesty and sharing. Our ceremonies and our lodges encompasses these lodges. And so the Healing to Wellness Court, it actually works with our participants and the families in the same way. And one quick story that I was kind of reminded of this morning actually was so we are really fortunate enough to have an Indigenous judge that leads us in this wellness court. And I'll never forget when I was fairly new in my role, a young man was standing in court and he was waiting his sentencing. And Justice Ladisser had told that young man that as a part of his sentence, that he was to go out and pick 30 braids of sweetgrass, and he was then to give them to people in his community. And you can only imagine that you could hear a pin drop in that courtroom because people didn't know how to document this. They didn't know how to write this in court forms. But that was actually the day that I knew that things were going to be changing and for the better. So that young man did come back a few months later, and he came back and reported to the court on what his experience was. But in that journey that led him to go out and do this medicine picking, he was connected to the elders and the knowledge keepers. He learned protocols, and he began learning that the way that you treat those medicines is how we should be treating one another. And so there's really big significance in that. And getting reconnected back to ceremony with his family and with his wife and children, because she too walked that healing journey along with him, which in the beginning, those charges were against harming his wife. And so beginning to then step into that role of the traditional roles of what a man is to provide for the family. And also that teaching that we have those teachings of reciprocity and that giving back and gifting that medicine to other community members as well. And so I think about, again, those principles of RJ, especially that reintegration piece. Because I think in this certain story, in this circumstance, that reintegration piece actually came really easy because those relationships were mended along the way. And I guess I believe that restorative justice brings it brings in the element of spirit and voice. And so for far too long, we have functioned in a system that just doesn't create space for a voice to be heard. And whether that's the one who's been harmed or who have caused harm, but to bring back voice of them and their families. And I also believe, much like the story of my late Muslim that I shared earlier, that we cannot expect healing to happen in spaces that don't involve love. And ensuring that everyone feels heard, understood, and validated. And so restorative justice gives space for this and should be implemented as part of mainstream justice and not just a diversionary program. I think about what our challenges have been in implementing something so new, and when we speak on alternative justice practices, that I think we should always be creating space for new opportunities. And I just think we function under this system for so long, and we know the stats are telling us that it's not working. And so if we're able to provide elements of restorative practices, especially with the Healing to Wellness Court, we really implement those laws of Indigenous beliefs and our ceremonies, because we learn so much from that, and that's who we are. And so I guess the challenge is in implementing something so different is much like implementing anything new, right? You're going to experience hurdles, you're going to experience challenges, you're going to experience resistance. But again, I just think if we are creating areas of healing and repair and accountability and just really implementing those laws of respect and honesty, much like that story I just shared of that young man going out, that's something so simple as picking our medicines, which actually encompasses much more. And if we get back to those original teachings, as we do as Indigenous peoples, that we understand how we can help one another. And that's through our laws, it's through our ceremonies, it's through the way that we show up for one another. We are establishing those relationships. And I think sooner or later, continuing this work and making it accessible everywhere is when we're going to be seeing those statistics, those high statistics actually come down. Hi.
Thanks, Vyomi. It's such a profound, explanation, all these challenges and your practices. And I would like to also ask our other panelists, and Nermin and Kate, would you like to also add your insights for this question?
Sure. I will add that our restorative justice work certainly intersects practices that are rooted in Indigenous ways of being, and we've been schooled about that by Janice earlier, as well as Wyoming today. But I have to admit that we intersect with the colonial criminal justice system. We get most of our referrals from police in the practice that I have. And in fact, I have to admit that part of the success we have in having offenders voluntarily participate in restorative justice is the fact that the alternative is facing charges in the criminal justice system. So although the criminal justice system tends to silence offenders because they won't speak until the Crown has proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt, we do have the ability to be in a truth-telling environment where they have to acknowledge the harm that they have done. And we start from that perspective, which gives us a head start. But there is definitely this juxtaposition between the criminal justice system and the Indigenous roots.
Thank you, Nermin. Kate?
Thank you. CJI, Community Justice Initiative's origins come from a story of a Mennonite community in Elmira, Ontario, around a parole officer who submitted to a judge a way that people who'd caused harm could take responsibility for it. And and CJI was founded as an organization shortly after that. And yet it has been clear to us as an organization that this work, without intention to be contributing to the work of decolonizing, uncolonizing the criminal justice system, is contributing to a white supremacist approach to addressing harm. And so while we aren't an Indigenous organization doing Indigenous work, our work is to disrupt the over-incarceration of Indigenous folks, which is at just skyrocketing levels. It's growing rather than shrinking. And so I see that as the responsibility of non-Indigenous organizations involved in this work, as well as naming who are our teachers. So Tanaga Myers taught me Circle. She's a Mohawk woman who was adopted into Anishinaabe community and has given me permission to do Circle work, and learning that with Circle, the pieces Wyoming spoke to, that when needs are attended to and love is in the room and support is in the room, needs can be met and accountability can be taken in ways that are healing for people.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all your valuable insights, Wyoming, Nermeen, and Karim. And it's important to recognize the profound impact that Indigenous perspectives have on restorative justice. And I would like to move us to the question about the ways in which how we define restorative justice, and starting with Nermeen. And how can it be specifically applied in the context of gender-based violence?
It is super challenging to define restorative justice. If you look it up, you find so many different responses and so many different types of restorative responses. In answering this, I chose to draw from a colleague I respect very much, Sujatha Baliga. She is a survivor of child sexual abuse. She was a victim advocate. She is a public defender in the US, and she's helped many communities across the US implement restorative justice diversion programs. She uses Howard Zerr as well in explaining her concept of restorative justice. And from what I've learned from her, she says restorative justice calls us to a paradigm shift in the way in which we think about harm and crime and wrongdoing in the world. Our current criminal justice system asks the questions, what law is broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished? Restorative justice asks a very different set of questions. It asks who was harmed, what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? Now, who was harmed, what do they need? We would ask that of any person we loved and cared about. Oh my gosh, this happened to you, what happened? What do you need? But this third piece, whose obligation is it to meet those needs? This third question, that makes it an approach to justice. And to answer this, we need some sort of safe dialogue between those who've caused harm and that holds them directly accountable to the self-identified needs of the person who has experienced the harm. To put this in context of gender-based violence, I'd like to share a story about a young woman who shared with us that her stepfather had made her very uncomfortable. He used to slap her behind jokingly, but only when nobody else was there. One night he came home drunk and asked to see her boobs. We listened to her, we believed her, we validated how difficult this must have been, and asked how his actions affected her then and how it affects her now. And she shared the details of those impacts. She explained how she had trouble trusting men. It even affected her relationship with her own birth father. For over a year, she isolated herself, didn't share with her mother, stopped seeing her friends. She didn't want to be the cause of the breakup between her mom and her stepfather. She only disclosed all this to her mom when her mom's relationship with her stepfather was about to end. We listened to her, we believed her, we validated how much of a heavy burden it must have been to hold that secret for so long. Then we asked her what she needed, and she wanted him to admit he did these things and take responsibility. She wanted him to state that she did nothing to invite such behavior, and she wanted him to stop behaving in this way to her and to anyone else in the future. Accountability and prevention, common goals. We met with her stepfather, We explained that to participate in restorative justice, he has to acknowledge responsibility for the harm and be willing to make amends in the way she needs. He agreed. After many meetings and much work, 10 months later, we were able to close the file with this letter that he wrote to her because she didn't want to meet him face to face, and it was her choice.
Thank you, Nermin. I would like to get also our participants' attention to also into chat. As we speak, we have a conversation about very sensitive topics, gender-based violence and all these experiences. Please, if you wish for support during the whole session, and here is the list of supports on the chat, you can reach out. And there are also support person available to connect with anonymously over the chat, over the event. Please be connect with them. Kate and Wyoming, I would like to also invite you to contribute this part of the concepts and the definition of restorative justice part.
Thanks for
Kate?
sharing that, Norman. Yeah, I want to just talk about accountability. I think if we were to just poll everyone listening to this webinar, is accountability important to you? We'd probably get 1,000% in agreement. And yet we might have different understandings of what we mean by accountability. And so I'm going to talk about meaningful accountability and what that means to me. As I listen to Norman's story, I wonder how it's sitting with people, and there might be folks listening and saying, those are just words on a paper. Anyone can write that. And that's okay, because what's important in restorative justice is, does it satisfy the victim? Is it satisfactory to the survivor engaging in this process? Because they have the opportunity, they're in the driver's seat of what is acceptable accountability. So in our practice that we call facilitated dialogue, we are asking the survivor, what does healing and justice look like for you? And perhaps they just need the person who offended to admit that they did it. They'd always denied it, said it never happened. And that caused all sorts of secondary trauma. So just them admitting it is satisfactory, even though for some of us, we might want to see more than that done. We're being guided by the survivor. For other survivors, they might need the opportunity to explain how that impacted them and to ask questions. And so we are seeing if the person who caused harm can provide meaningful accountability in that way, never bringing parties together where we see that need can't be met. These needs can also be met indirectly as well. So we work with people who have offended who act as surrogates. So one of the impacts for survivors is often feeling their power's been taken away. And so instead of choosing to sit down with the person who harmed them, they could sit down with someone else who caused harm and have a conversation and start to get some power back. They could have a conversation with their parent who didn't believe them when they disclosed that they had been harmed, and that secondary trauma still impacts them today. So that's what I mean by meaningful accountability.
Thank you, Katie. Wyoming?
Yeah, I really like that that piece. And again, I know I touched on it a little bit in the previous question, but I guess what RJ kind of means for me is I think of the roles of who is at these tables or in these spaces, right? For sure, ensuring the safety and that it is driven by the person who has been harmed. But I also think about when you're rallying, I like to say this because I know Sharon Steinhauer is listening right now, but she always talks about, who are you rallying this village? Who's in this village that you're getting together to come and support this process? So when I think about circle process, and again, that accountability piece, but also knowing that like, yes, the accountability comes from the person who's caused the harm, but then I also think about when we're, especially the reintegration piece that I keep going back to, is how is the community also showing accountability? What roles do they play? And I know I actually heard that a bit earlier as well. But yeah, I think I'll just stop sharing from there. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing your experience and also approaches. Wyoming, I would like to continue with you since you started to, for the previous question also, you were talking about the healing without love, it's impossible. And how do you how do you center survivors in trauma-informed way, and what concrete steps do you take to ensure their safety throughout the restorative justice processes? I would like to continue with you, Wyoming, then
Yeah,
invite other
thank you.
speakers.
I think again that value, that law of love is so crucial. It's so important. Again, I always relate it back to I guess from my perspective and from the people that I work with, which is directly in Indigenous folks. So when I think about, actually another story popped up when I was just hearing this. I am a big storyteller, but I'll try to keep it really brief. When I think about how we're centering and making sure that everything's trauma informed, a story popped up. It was actually a family member of mine, and they were going through the system. They were a victim of sexual violence, and even just that piece alone is it can be re-traumatizing for a lot of the people that we've worked with when you go into a trial space, and just not creating that space of like a good environment to share your story. Anyways, what had happened was she was transported with her offender in the same vehicle that was actually brought to the courthouse, and this was in our area. And so when we talk about ensuring safety, ensuring trauma informed, that was definitely not the approach that should have been taken. And so when I think again, how do we center survivors in the trauma informed ways? Again, I always think that if we were to put them into the center, and not like physically, but if we approached it in meeting their needs and ensuring that they have been seen, heard, and validated again, that I just think the process would work in probably a much better way. I think I'll let someone else chime in, and if I have something else that I need to share, I'll do so.
Thanks, Wyoming. Kate?
I think it's important to distinguish around the topic of gender-based harm and restorative justice that intimate partner violence and sexual harm bring different risks and require different ways of preparing. At CJI, we don't do cases of intimate partner violence restoratively. The risk of lethality around intimate partner violence is a real thing. Femicide in the country is something that happens, and we know, Lundy Bancroft has written a lot, and other authors around how, the idea of mediation, this isn't mediation, but how mediation can be used as a tool of violence. Whereas sexual harm has different dynamics, some overlapping and some that are different. And so that is something we'd screen for. There are some best practices that exist for organizations that do intimate partner violence restoratively, and certainly in the transformative justice community, there's a lot of literature on how community members can support and care for one another outside of any organization. The way that we attend to safety is this is a slow process with a lot of checking in. These cases develop over, months and years. 12, 18, 24 months isn't unusual because we allow people to pause and stop, at the pace of their readiness, and checking in around safety needs at virtually every meeting. When we're preparing for a dialogue, should a case move to dialogue, we would have established with a survivor-driven conversation who is sitting where, who will speak first, what if What if you come into the room and that person is no longer taking the accountability that we expected them to? What if they do something that surprises you? What if we prepare and make space to not move forward if any of that doesn't feel safe?
Thanks, Katie. Nermeen?
My colleagues are so smart. They've already said much of what needs to be said, but I'll add a couple things just to consider. You know, I want to consider the criminal justice system as we have it. Do they center survivors in any way whatsoever? Are they even allowed into the process as a victim? No, they're called witnesses, and only after a conviction do they even get a chance to make a victim impact statement. And we know that the conviction rates for such situations like sexual assaults and other gender-based violence, we're looking at less than a percentage of folks that actually get convicted. So sometimes people come at this thinking, are you actually centering survivors here in a restorative process? Shouldn't you be punishing the offender? And you have to think about it first as, are we actually punishing anybody with less than 1% in the criminal justice system getting convicted? And also consider, what does the survivor want? Does the survivor want to be punished? In the example I gave, you know, that young girl didn't want to punish her stepfather. She had so many mixed up feelings about all of that. And the last thing she would have done is gone to court. And I realize I'm responding a little bit to the question and a little bit to some of the chit chat I'm noticing in the commentary that's coming in. But I do want to emphasize that this is all about the survivor who's in front of us and what their needs are. We do not do anything without them saying this is what they want, and we don't do anything further than what they want either.
Thanks, Nerman. Yes, we have a lot just going on in chat and also for the Q&A part, and resonates with all your insights, experiences, and sharing insights. Okay, thank you again for all sharing your experience and approaches. And I know it's very helpful for people to keep this in mind for all of us, and it's part of the process of doing restorative justice, right? And now I would like to also continue to our next question. What is a common misunderstanding or misrepresentation of restorative justice as it's going on in the chat? And how can we clarify or correct these misunderstandings in the broader community? I would like to continue with you, Katie.
Thank you. I mean, I love this question. So I would say I'm going to name 5 things. The first is that in restorative justice, that we are mediating sexual harm. That is not what's happening here. In a typical mediation, you would have a mediator listening to 2 sides of a story and coming up with an agreement that is compromising of both parties. That is nothing like what happens in restorative justice. In restorative justice, you have typically a co-facilitation team meeting with both parties to prepare them to have a conversation with one another. And those facilitators have no influence on what comes of that conversation. That is entirely dependent on the participants. That the harm happened is not negotiable. That isn't on the table. And that we're not looking for a solution or an agreement, but instead, what is it the survivor needs out of this process? So that's 1. Number 2 is that restorative justice is about forgiveness and reconciliation. And I think people can be forgiven for believing that because restorative justice has talked that way in the past. There's been parts of that's really been amplified. That's not my experience of the communities I see doing that work now. It's really about meeting needs, building meaningful accountability as a pathway for people to move forward in their lives and the trauma to be addressed. For some, it means that people can coexist in community with one another, while for others, they leave the process with an understanding that no further contact is to be had. The third is that it's inherently dangerous to do this process due to power imbalances. And certainly each case requires careful consideration. However, as I named earlier, it's typically the intimate partner violence cases and not the sexual harm pieces where these higher risks exist, although risk assessment is always important to do. Where we're not seeing accountability or interest to grow accountability, a process would end before dialogue. We can address power imbalances by handing decision-making power to the victim survivor, by asking them if they would like to bring support people into the room. So they're like, power isn't static in some forms, right? We can address power. That sexual offenders are manipulators, predators, and can't be trusted to engage with restorative justice with integrity. And so that's how I came into restorative justice, believing that. And so what I have seen is that there is no extrinsic reward for engaging in this process. So we only take community-based referrals at CJI. There is a moratorium in the Criminal Code 717 that doesn't allow Crown attorneys to refer cases out. And so we have community-based referrals. These folks have not been charged. They're engaging in the process out of a desire to meet the needs of folks they've harmed. And I would just name that those involved in gender-based violence work know that we are far from living in a culture of consent. Sexual boundaries and violations happen all the time, causing harm. We know that most sexual harm is caused between youth, often from one sibling to another. And so when we're talking about those who sexually offend, like, these are folks that we that are included under that, and the terms, manipulators and predators just isn't appropriate. And then screening for readiness is how we are addressing this as well. Like, we do not hear full accountability when people who've caused harm come to us and say they will participate in the process. That threshold of admitting harm happened is what we're listening for. But we hear folks minimizing harm, rationalizing harm, justifying harm, intellectualizing harm, victim blaming, absolutely. And these are the pieces we try to work with. If we don't see movement, we don't go forward. But we often see movement and light bulbs go on, waves of shame happening with this work, and can make real progress. I think I said I had 5 myths. That was 4.
Thank you, Katie. Unfortunately, we are also going to end, but Nermeen and Wyoming, I would like to also invite you to just put your insights for this question. Then I would like to also go to our next final question for all of you.
I'll keep mine a little bit brief, but I think one of the most common misunderstandings or misrepresentations in our area is, again, I guess, kind of going back to that diversionary program, because I guess the referrals that we get are directly from Crown prosecutor. And when speaking in community, when the victim is left out of this process, which sometimes we've seen that happen, or we've heard of that happening, that not only is that causing obviously further harm, but it's, again, we have this narrative that taking a restorative justice route is taking the easy way out. And so I think about that as continuing to educate our communities, continuing to educate ourselves, because this is definitely a lifelong learning lesson for everybody, because it's new, right? And I think just keep pushing onto that resistance if it is being experienced in your area, and I guess just continuing to be the advocate. Thank you.
Thank you, Wyoming. We have almost 5 minutes left, and I would like to just ask all of you, unfortunately, because of the time, what are the key opportunities for growth or improvement in the application of restorative justice within the gender-based violence sector, and how can we work toward them? And unfortunately, I can only give you 2 minutes for each of you. Nermeen?
I'll say that don't assume you know what's best for the victim survivor. Empower her with a choice. Tell them about the possibility of an information-only report and let her decide if a referral to restorative justice would be the path that she would want. I would say that would be one. And then the other is please don't assume that restorative justice means a face-to-face encounter must happen. That's never a must. It's always victim survivor choice as to how they want this to proceed.
Thank you, Nermin. Wyoming?
Yeah, I just think we've kind of heard this common theme of just continuing to bring awareness on the different possibilities, the different routes that can take place. Again, like we always speak on, like the planting the seeds of possibility, right? And one method, one process might not work for everybody, but just always giving that opportunity, that space for the healing to happen and the healing to begin in however way that meets the needs of everybody that's involved.
Thanks, Wyoming. Katie?
Thanks. I'll share two things. I think we need to understand that restorative justice applied with an anti-racism, anti-oppression framework is one pathway out of uncolonizing justice, policing trauma, mental health, poverty, race. It is one part of the solution. Secondly, the cases that have the most success are when folks participating in them are well supported. And so the work that the Violence Against Women community does to support survivors helps build readiness for restorative work. What's missing is the work done for men and by men around helping men be able to be more accountable and their readiness to come to this work. That just doesn't exist, and it needs to in order for people to take more accountability and address harm.
Thank you. Thank you all. There are many contributions and ideas for us to think about today, and especially the conversations around the misrepresentation and the application and all the definitions and also misinterpretation of the restorative justice. I think it's extremely rich, valuable, and we need extremely more time to discuss all these things. And thank you for all again for sharing your experiences and also your work with us today. And we hope for all our participants and for us, today's discussions has provided a new perspectives and also practical takeaways that will support your work, our work moving forward. And wishing you everyone a continued thoughtful and impactful journey in this area. And now I will pass on to Margarita.